We're going to end today's news by ending on the BBC, but surprisingly I have to bring in Boris Johnson again, because this story's been unfolding over the last few days and I think is extremely interesting. Here's the Express. Boris Johnson denies BBC chairman helped arrange an 800,000 loan for a hard-up Prime Minister. Now, when you read these articles, there's quite a bit of detail about how much Boris Johnson has been earning at any particular time. And he's quoted as saying it's very difficult for him to live on about £142,000 a year because he's got a lot of family commitments. And, you know, you can understand this puts him under quite a bit of pressure. And he's described the BBC allegations about what's going on as being nonsense. Now remember that this is the BBC chairman Richard Sharp that's being named in these articles. So we got some interesting things happening. So here's the BBC News report. Apparently Boris was offered an 800,000 loan to top up his income. And the allegation is that BBC's chairman Richard Sharp was involved in arranging it. And this came out in a report in an article by the Sunday Times. So Mr. Sharp denies being involved in any loan, while Mr. Johnson says his financial interests have been properly declared. But why would he need a loan this big in the first place? Well, if you're Boris Johnson, you know, living on £140,000 a year is tricky. And I think that's only fair. So here's the Times, the BBC chairman, the Prime Minister and the 800,000 loan guarantee. The BBC chairman, according to the Times, helped to arrange a guarantee on a loan of up to 800,000 for Boris Johnson weeks before the then Prime Minister recommended him for the role. Richard Sharp was involved in talks about financing Johnson's Downing Street lifestyle in November and December 2020. And then it goes on to say Sharp 66, a former bankerat, but then you get hit by the Times paywall. But I went to a different source. So here we are. Who is the BBC chairman? The former banker who is in his 60s, worked for more than 30 years in the financial sector, including a 23-year stint at investment giant Goldman Sachs, where he was reportedly mentored by Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. Before this, he worked in both commercial and investment banking for JP Morgan.
It's so incestuous, isn't it?
It's incestuous, but of course, those huge banking groups are rubbing their hands with glee at the moment because they can make profit out of the war in Ukraine. But this shows how dirty it is. And if Boris Johnson is a man having to take on huge loans, he's struggling with his finance. Is that how his strings are being pulled in Ukraine? Possibly. But let's have a look at how Britain's former Prime Minister defends himself. Let's have a look at this clip.
Would you welcome an inquiry into that?
This is a load of complete nonsense, absolute nonsense. Let me just tell you, Richard Sharp is a good and a wise man. But he knows absolutely nothing about my personal finances. I can tell you that for 100% ding-dang sure. This is just another example of the BBC disappearing up its own fundament. And that, I propose, is
so it's just a coincidence that this appointment was arranged?
Well, there we are. Would you trust Boris Johnson? I certainly wouldn't. And we wait to see how this interesting little snake's wedding of interaction develops. But just before we leave the BBC completely on this issue at least, let's just jump back to a BBC report which has come out about the two Britons, Chris Parry and Andrew Bagshaw, killed in Soledar rescue attempt. Now remember that although the BBC never reports it properly, the fighting in Soledar has been vicious. It's now emerged that these two men were killed. I just wanted to bring on screen that reports from Russian sources, which I have seen, indicate these two men were found in a fighting trench at the front in Soledar. And so I would like to know what the real truth is about their work and death. And I'm not saying the Russian reports were correct. It was just that pictures were circulated on social media of two bodies in a fighting trench. And this is where apparently identity details were found. But what is the true story about what they were doing? the truth is what we need, I feel. But I just wanted to highlight that the BBC couldn't resist using this very sad and emotional story as an opportunity to mislead the public. So if you look at the story, you'll find that they use a map back from the 17th of January, and this allows the BBC to fool the British public into thinking that Soledar is still in Ukrainian hands. So the BBC is not going to tell the truth if it possibly can. And I think that just takes us on to a few final comments from Alex.
Yes.
It just gets better and better, gentlemen, because our and finalists are being supplied by our viewers these days. So I would say go ye and do likewise. What does our viewer have to say? I recently bought a time machine and an internet truth filter from an online retail giant. I was a bit skeptical at first, as it wasn't that expensive, a bit like Debbie's devices, but the feedback from the seller was good, so I thought I'd give it a whirl. I plugged both the time machine and the truth filter into my personal computer, as they came with handy USB ports. I thought that I would try it out on a website which had some need of elucidation, so I picked the BBC. Look what happened. Here we are, BBC News, and now this is a whole genre going back 20 years, skits on the BBC News website. But this is a UK column viewers version, so we have Matt Hancock referred to courts for PPE tax fraud and illegal investments. We have the NHS admitting that wearing a mask is as effective as some of the treatments for COVID. We have scary picture of woman in mask walking through dry ice. We have Andrew Bridgen pleased with his nomination for Prime Minister. We have woman calling Boris Johnson an unrepeatable. We have the inventor of the PCR test in the court over use, and I'll read the sub-headline for this one as well. I see Debbie's chuckling in the background. You can freeze to read all of the subheaders, but as this one I'll read out. PCR test inventor Dr. Eldritch, that's not the real PCR test inventor, I have to hasten to add, claims that his test was actually designed for removing big tricky bogies and had nothing at all to do with the virus. And finally, what is known about the new COVID variant YYUR-YYUBICUR-YY4ME? Pretty good stuff. And then the viewer finishes with this. Feel free to share this on UK Column News, as some folk in the chat box didn't believe that this would work. But please don't tell my wife, as she thinks I've spent the money on a new coffee machine. Thanks for the great work you are all doing, and further nice compliments, including somebody who managed to listen carefully enough to hear what we were saying in the Motherwell recording. So not all of the flack we got was please improve the audio. But what's the Motherwell event that's just been happened has been recorded in much better audio. So when that goes up, you're in for a pleasant surprise as well.
Alex, thank you for that. And we'll end on a furry friend who I met in Scotland over the weekend. I turned around to see these eyes looking at me. And clearly the thought process was, are you still watching BBC News? Because if so, I'm watching you. So we'll see whether one of our viewers at least can identify who that lovely doggy is. But, well, we need a little bit of uplift, don't we, after the quality of the news at the moment.
Back in a couple of minutes for some extra.
Okay. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Debbie. We'll see you shortly. Bye-bye.